Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
For 5 years, I sent $500 a month to my son's university. But yesterday, the dean called, "We never received your money. Your son doesn't study here." When I checked the bank transfers, all the money went to an account. Welcome back, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I always thought I was a good mother. Not a perfect one, I never claimed that, but a good one. The kind who showed up. The kind who sacrificed quietly, without keeping score, because that's what you do when you love someone. My name is Margaret Callahan. Everyone calls me Peggy. I'm 52 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. And for the better part of my adult life, I have worked as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized construction firm downtown. It's not glamorous work. It's spreadsheets and invoices and the particular satisfaction of numbers that balance. I am good at it. I am methodical. I notice things. I raised my son Daniel alone. His father, Kevin, died of a heart attack when Daniel was 11. Sudden, senseless. The kind of loss that reshapes a person permanently. After that, it was just the two of us in that house on Clearfield Avenue, and I poured everything I had into that boy. Every overtime shift, every skipped vacation, every birthday wish I ever made. All of it pointed in one direction. Make sure Daniel has more than I did. When Daniel told me he wanted to study business administration at Hargrove University in Michigan, I was proud in a way I hadn't felt since the day he was born. Hargrove wasn't an Ivy League school, but it had a solid reputation, a good placement rate, and a campus Daniel had visited twice and claimed to love. He was 18, eager, full of plans. I believed every word he said. Why wouldn't I? The tuition, room, and board came to roughly $6,000 a semester. Between his partial scholarship and what I could manage, we worked out a plan. I would send $500 a month consistently to cover his living expenses and any gaps in fees. Daniel had a part-time job lined up. He said he'd handle the rest. For the first year, everything seemed fine. He called every Sunday. He told me about his professors, his roommate, a guy named Trey from Detroit. He mentioned a girl he liked in his economics class. He sent me a photo of himself on the quad in November, wearing a navy hoodie with the Hargrove logo on it, squinting into the cold sun. I printed that photo and put it on the refrigerator. I looked at it every morning. I sent the money through online bank transfers, the same way I paid every bill. $500 first of every month into the account Daniel had opened when he started school. Reliable as sunrise. The first time something felt slightly off was during his second year. I asked him about midterms, and he gave me an answer that was just vague enough to register somewhere in the back of my mind. They went okay. Pretty standard stuff. He changed the subject quickly, too quickly, moving on to a story about a road trip he and some friends were planning for spring break. I let it go. I told myself I was being an anxious mother, the worst kind of hovering. Then, in his third year, I noticed he rarely mentioned specific classes anymore. No professor names. No complaints about assignments, which even the most dedicated students have. When I asked directly, he'd give me something plausible but thin. I've got a group project. Business law is brutal this semester. Always just enough to quiet my worry, never enough to paint a real picture. I also noticed that when I asked about his transcript, about grades, he always had a reason why he hadn't gotten around to sending it. The school was updating their portal. He'd been busy. He'd do it next week. He never did. I told myself I trusted him. And I did. That was the problem. By his fourth year, he had a girlfriend. Haley. I'd spoken to her twice on the phone. Breezy, confident. the kind of girl who filled silences easily and said very little of substance. Daniel seemed devoted to her. He mentioned her constantly. He also mentioned, for the first time, that he might need an extra semester to finish his degree because he'd shifted his concentration. I said that was fine. I kept sending the money. 30 months of $500 transfers. Then another 12. Then another 6. 60 months in total. 60 transfers. $30,000. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in March, drinking coffee and reviewing my calendar, when my phone rang. The area code was Michigan. I assumed it was Daniel. It wasn't. "Is this Margaret Callahan?" The voice was professional, measured, a man in his 50s perhaps. "Yes," I said. "This is Richard Okafor. I'm the Director of Student Financial Services at Hargrove University. I'm calling regarding an inquiry we received about a student account." "Ma'am, I want to be careful how I say this. We've done a thorough internal search, and we have no record of a Daniel Callahan ever being enrolled at this institution. Not currently, and not at any point in the last 5 years." The coffee cup was in my hand. I remember that detail precisely because I set it down very slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter something. "I'm sorry," I said. "Can you repeat that?" He did. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after the call ended, staring at nothing in particular, listening to the refrigerator hum. On the door, that old photo of Daniel in the Hargrove hoodie smiled at me from across the room. I thought about 60 months. I thought about $30,000. I thought about every Sunday phone call, every vague answer, every excuse about the transcript. And then, very slowly, like a woman stepping out onto ice she already knows is cracked, I opened my laptop and pulled up 5 years of bank statements. The bank statements were organized by year. I keep meticulous records, an occupational habit, and I went through them the way I go through a client's accounts when something doesn't add up. Methodically, line by line. No emotion, not yet. Just numbers. The first transfer, August 1st, 5 years ago. $500 to an account ending in 7741. Then September, October, November. Every month without exception for 60 consecutive months. The math was simple and brutal. $30,000. I printed every page. I stacked them in a neat pile on the kitchen table. Then I sat back and let myself actually look at what I'd built. Not a record of tuition payments, not a ledger of maternal investment, but a paper monument to 5 years of lies. For about 20 minutes, I didn't think anything coherent at all. My mind kept sliding off the facts, the way it does when something is too large to hold all at once. I'd look at the number, $30,000, and my brain would simply refuse it. This couldn't be right. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the university had made an administrative error. Maybe Daniel had transferred schools and forgotten to tell me. Maybe the man on the phone had the wrong file. But I am a bookkeeper. I deal in evidence, not comfort. And the evidence was on my kitchen table, 30 pages deep. I called Hargrove back that afternoon and asked to speak with Richard Okafor again. He was patient, thorough, and unambiguous. There was no Daniel Callahan in their enrollment records. Not under that name, not under a similar name, not as a transfer, not as an auditing student. They had no record of any financial correspondence with me, no invoices, no payment confirmations, nothing. I asked if perhaps someone else could have enrolled using his identity. He said that was a matter for law enforcement to investigate, but from the university's perspective, the record was clear. I thanked him and hung up. Then I called Daniel. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice, bright, casual, the voice I'd heard every Sunday for 5 years. told me to leave a message. I didn't. I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about what I actually knew about my son's life. I knew his cell number. I knew the address of an apartment in Ann Arbor he'd moved into in his second year, or so he'd told me. I had a photo of him on a campus that I'd never personally visited. I had 60 bank transfers and 0 transcripts, and the memory of every vague, rehearsed answer he'd given me when I asked about his classes. What did I actually know? The grief came then in one hard wave. Not gentle, not gradual. It came the way Kevin's death had come, as a sudden restructuring of reality, the world reorganized around a new and terrible fact. I cried at the kitchen table until I ran out of tears, and then I sat in the silence of a house that had felt like sacrifice for 5 years and now felt like something else entirely. But here is the thing about grief, at least for me. It has always had a short runway. I am my father's daughter, a man who lost his factory job at 50 and started a lawn care business within a month. The Callahans don't stay down. We take inventory, and then we move. I gave myself until 7 o'clock that evening to fall apart. Then I washed my face, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat back down at the kitchen table with a legal pad. First, what did I know for certain? I knew Daniel had received $30,000 from me over 5 years. I knew he was not a student at Hargrove. I knew he had actively maintained the deception, phone calls, stories, a staged photo, excuses about transcripts. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a sustained, deliberate fraud. Second, who else might be involved? Haley. Daniel had started mentioning her in his 3rd year, precisely when his details about university life had become thinnest. I didn't know Haley's last name. I didn't know where she lived. But I had a name. And I had the internet. And I had the patience of a woman who had just discovered she'd been robbed by her only child. Third, what did I want? This was the question I sat with longest. The easy answer was the money back. But that wasn't really it, or not only it. What I wanted was the truth on record, in a form that couldn't be walked back with a sob story and an apology. I wanted accountability. I'd spent 5 years in the dark, and I was done with the dark. I wrote 3 things at the top of the legal pad. 1. Document everything. 2. Find out where he actually is. 3. Talk to a lawyer before I talk to Daniel. That last one was the important one. Every instinct I had said to call my son, confront him, demand answers. But I'd been a bookkeeper long enough to know that the moment a subject knows they're being investigated, evidence disappears. Daniel was smart. He'd proven that. If I called him in a panic, he'd have time to prepare. He'd cry. He'd explain. He'd construct something that sounded almost true, and I'd want so badly to believe it that I might let him. I was not going to let him. I closed the legal pad. I looked at his photo on the refrigerator one more time. Then I took it down, turned it face down on the counter, and went to bed. In the morning, I was going to find an attorney. The law office of Patricia Drummond was on the 4th floor of a glass building on Broad Street, 2 blocks from where I worked. I'd driven past it 100 times. I'd never had reason to go inside. Patricia Drummond was 60, compact, with silver hair cut short, and a manner that reminded me of a school principal. Not unkind, but not interested in wasted time. Her specialty was civil litigation, with a secondary focus on financial fraud. Her assistant had fit me in for a consultation that Thursday, and I arrived 12 minutes early with my printed bank statements in a manila folder. I laid everything out on her desk: the 60 transfers, the call from Hargrove, my notes from the legal pad. She listened without interrupting, glancing at the documents as I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "what your son has done is wire fraud, possibly also theft by deception, depending on how Ohio's statutes apply. The federal angle comes in because this involved repeated electronic transfers across state lines over a period of years." She paused. "This isn't small." I asked her what I should do first. "Document the deception as thoroughly as possible before you confront anyone," she said. "File a report with your local police, both for the record and because you'll need a case number for any civil proceedings. Do not contact your son yet. Do not warn him in any way. And if he contacts you, be normal. Say nothing that indicates you know." Be normal? I almost laughed. I wasn't sure I remembered what that felt like. I filed the police report that same afternoon at the Columbus PD's non-emergency desk. The officer who took my statement, a young woman named Reyes, who couldn't have been more than 28, was professional and thorough. She told me that given the amount and the duration, the case would likely be reviewed by the Financial Crimes Unit. She gave me a case number. She told me not to move any money. I drove home and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. There was a particular quality to the silence now. Not the quiet of a normal life, but the quiet of something that had already started moving, gathering speed, becoming unstoppable. 2 days after I filed the report, Daniel called me. I was at my desk at work when my phone buzzed. His name on the screen. I breathed once, picked up. "Hey, Mom." Cheerful, relaxed. Exactly the same voice I'd been hearing for 5 years. "Hi, sweetheart." I sounded steady. I surprised myself. He talked for 12 minutes. He told me about a project he was working on, something vague about a business pitch competition. He asked how I was feeling. He mentioned Haley might visit her parents soon. I made the right noises. I asked 1 or 2 gentle questions. I gave him nothing. After I hung up, I sat very still for a long moment. Then I wrote down everything he'd said, word for word, as accurately as I could remember, and added it to the folder. The real break came 10 days later, and it came not from a lawyer or a detective, but from a woman named Carol Simmons, who lived in Ann Arbor and was the mother of Daniel's actual roommate. I had found her through a combination of stubborn internet searching and luck. Daniel had mentioned his roommate Trey in his first year. A search for men named Trey at Daniel's supposed Ann Arbor address turned up a Trevor Simmons, 25, who appeared on a local recreational soccer league roster. Trevor's mother was on Facebook. We had 3 mutual friends, the loose overlap of 2 Midwest lives. I sent her a message. She called me the next morning. Carol Simmons was warm, puzzled, and immediately cooperative. Yes, her son Trevor had lived with a young man named Daniel for about 8 months, starting 5 years ago. No, Daniel had not been a student anywhere, as far as Trey knew. Daniel worked occasionally at a sports bar, dealt in informal resale, sneakers, electronics, and lived primarily off what Carol diplomatically called outside support. He and Haley Marsh had moved in together about 3 years ago. Carol had Haley's last name. She had their street address. I thanked her, wrote down everything, and then I simply sat there while the last door of doubt swung closed. He had never enrolled. He had never intended to enroll. He had taken the Hargrove hoodie photo somewhere on a college campus. Any campus would do. To send me something that looked real. He had constructed, with patience and consistency, a false life designed specifically to sustain my belief and my money for as long as possible. 5 years. I called Patricia Drummond and gave her Haley Marsh's full name and address. "Good," she said, in her principal's voice. "Now we can begin." Patricia had moved quickly. Within 2 weeks of our first meeting, she had sent a formal demand letter to Daniel's Ann Arbor address, citing the 60 transfers, the fraudulent misrepresentation, and the total amount of $30,000, and requesting either full restitution or a structured repayment agreement within 15 days. The letter was copied to her firm, to the Columbus PD Financial Crimes Unit detective who had taken over my case, a man named Arthur Webb, and to a civil court filing that Patricia had already initiated. I had also, on Detective Webb's recommendation, submitted formal documentation to the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, given the electronic nature of the fraud and the interstate element. Webb had been clear-eyed about expectations. Federal involvement was possible, but not guaranteed. The civil case was the more reliable track. What I had not expected was how fast Daniel would find out, and what he would do when he did. I was in my kitchen on a Wednesday evening, eating leftovers and reading, when my phone rang. Not Daniel's number. Haley's. I hadn't known Haley had my number, and the sight of an unfamiliar Michigan area code with a name Patricia had since attached to a contact entry sent a cold current through me. I picked up. Peggy. Her voice was nothing like the breezy, pleasant voice I'd heard twice on the phone years ago. It was flat, controlled. "I think we should talk." "Hello, Haley," I said. "What you're doing is going to destroy Daniel's life. I need you to understand that. He is your son." The word landed with an emphasis that was meant to function as a weapon. A reminder that I was a mother, that mothers forgave, that anything less was monstrous. "I understand he's my son," I said. I had Patricia's voice in my head. "Do not negotiate. Do not engage emotionally. Stay factual." "He made mistakes," Haley said. "He was young. He panicked. That's not a crime. It's a family problem. And you're dragging police into it like he's some kind of criminal." Her tone shifted, softened deliberately. "If you drop this, he'll pay you back. Slowly. But he will. We both will. We have some savings. Please have him contact Patricia Drummond," I said. "Her information is in the letter." A pause. The softness evaporated. "You know what you'll do to him if you push this? He could go to prison. You'd put your own son in prison over money." "He put himself in this position," I said. My voice stayed even. I was faintly amazed by it. "Please contact the attorney." She hung up. 20 minutes later, Daniel called. I let it ring. He called 3 more times that evening and twice the next morning. On the second morning call, I picked up. He was crying. Daniel had always been able to cry effectively. I recognize that now, though the recognition felt like swallowing glass. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been lost and scared, and couldn't find a way to tell me he'd never enrolled. That one lie had become 2 and then 20, and then 1,000. He said Haley had nothing to do with it. He said he loved me. "I know you love me," I said. "Contact Patricia Drummond." "Mom, I have to go to work," I said, and I hung up. The next day, the calls shifted in tone. Daniel left a voicemail that used the word regret 4 times and the phrase "what this will do to the family" twice, as though we had a sprawling family rather than just the 2 of us. That evening, a text from an unknown number, later traced to a prepaid phone, said simply, "You should think carefully about what you're starting." I forwarded it immediately to Detective Webb and to Patricia. Patricia called me the next morning. "This is actually helpful for us," she said. "Document everything, keep your doors locked, and do not respond." She had already filed for an emergency protective order based on the threatening text, and the judge had granted it. 3 days later, Daniel and Haley drove down to Columbus. I know this because my neighbor, Frank Adiola, mentioned seeing a silver Honda in front of my house for about 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon while I was at my sister Barbara's. They did not attempt to enter. They sat outside. Then they left. Then, when Patricia heard this, Her voice went quiet in a specific way that told me she was taking careful notes. "They're recalibrating," she said. "They're scared now. That's when people make mistakes." I took that weekend at Barbara's in Dayton as something more intentional after that. Barbara is 4 years older than me, a retired school nurse, and she has been my North Star since childhood. I sat at her kitchen table, a different kitchen table than the one in Columbus, one with a yellow tablecloth and the smell of her jasmine candle, and told her everything from the beginning. She listened the way good listeners do, completely, without rushing to comfort or advise. When I finished, she poured me more tea and said, "You're doing the right thing." "It doesn't feel like the right thing," I said. "It feels like the worst thing." "I know," she said. "That's how you know it's the right one." I stayed 3 days. I slept 9 hours a night, something I hadn't done in months. I walked in the park near Barbara's house in the mornings, in the cold, and I let the process, legal, official, unstoppable, move forward without me having to push it every moment. It was already moving. I had set it in motion. My part, for now, was to rest and hold steady. I came back from Barbara's on a Tuesday. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Same rooms, same quiet, same yellow notepad on the kitchen table. But I felt different inside it. Less fragile, more resolved. The call from Haley came that Thursday. Not the controlled, flat voice from before. This was something warmer, more carefully constructed. She asked how I was doing. She said Daniel had been in a dark place and they were both terrified. But they had been talking, really talking, and they wanted to try to handle this as a family. "We don't want to involve any more lawyers," she said. "We want to make this right, just between all of us. Quietly." A pause, timed for effect. "He's your son, Peggy. Don't you think there's a way to do this that doesn't destroy his future?" I was standing at the kitchen window, watching a neighbor walk his dog in the pale March light. I let Haley's words settle, and then I measured them the way I measure a ledger, against the real numbers underneath. The real numbers were 60 transfers, $30,000, 5 years of staged Sunday phone calls, a Hargrove hoodie bought specifically to deceive me, a threatening text from a prepaid phone, and 2 people who had sat outside my house in a silver Honda saying nothing because they had realized their leverage was gone. "Haley," I said, "everything goes through Patricia Drummond. That hasn't changed." A beat. I could hear her breathing. "You're making a mistake," she said, and the warmth drained out instantly. "Maybe," I said pleasantly. "Have a good evening." After I hung up, I stood at the window for another minute, watching the dog trot down the street. I was waiting for the guilt to arrive. The guilt that had always been my weakest wall, the one Daniel had been exploiting since childhood. It didn't come. That surprised me. And then it didn't. The following week, I heard from 2 more people. The first was Renee Morton, a woman from my church who had known Daniel since he was small. Renee called to ask, delicately, if there was trouble with Daniel. Someone had apparently called her, she wouldn't say who, and suggested that I was being harsh and unreasonable over what was essentially a family financial dispute. Renee's tone wasn't accusatory. She was genuinely trying to understand. I told her, briefly and factually, what had happened. 60 months. $30,000. A university that had never heard of my son. There was a long silence. Then, "Oh, Peggy." "I'm handling it," I said. "Of course you are," Renee said. I'm so sorry. Do you need anything?" That was the question that undid me. A little. I sat down on the couch and told her yes. Actually, I did need something. I needed people in my life to know the truth, because Daniel and Haley had clearly begun a quiet campaign to pre-frame the story before it became public. Renee understood immediately and said she would make herself available if I needed a character witness. The second contact was a woman named Linda Marsh, Haley's mother, who had found my number through means I still don't fully understand. She called on a Sunday morning, apologetic and clearly distressed. She said she hadn't known what her daughter was involved in. She said Haley had told the family the money was a gift, that I had offered it freely, that everything was above board. She was crying intermittently, and I believed her distress was genuine. I was careful with Linda. She hadn't done anything to me, and she was a mother in an awful position. I told her what I'd told Renee, the facts, plainly. She asked what she could do. I told her to tell the truth if anyone official asked her questions. After we hung up, I wrote up the conversation and sent it to Patricia. Patricia called that afternoon, and for the first time, I heard something in her voice that sounded almost like satisfaction. Haley's own mother, she said. She didn't know, I said. That may be true, Patricia said. It's also now in the record. Daniel and Haley's version of events, that this was an informal family arrangement, is going to be much harder to sustain when her mother contradicts it. She paused. Peggy, I want you to know, this case is solid. They are running out of story. I also joined, that month, a small support group for fraud victims, primarily financial fraud, mostly elder fraud, which at 52 I didn't fully consider myself part of, but the dynamics were familiar enough. The group met Tuesday evenings at a community center on the north side. There were 7 regulars. 3 of them had been defrauded by family members. One woman, Doris, had discovered her nephew had been forging her checks for 11 years. I sat in a folding chair in that fluorescent-lit room and for the first time understood that what had happened to me was not, primarily, a story about me. It was a story about what Daniel had chosen to do. The distinction sounds simple, but it took me a long time to truly feel it. I had not failed as a mother. I had been deceived by someone who had studied me carefully for 25 years and knew exactly which levers to pull, knowing it was different from feeling it. But the Tuesday group helped me close the distance. They came on a Saturday in April. I knew they were coming because Daniel had, for the first time, texted in advance and asked if he could stop by. No mention of Haley. Just, Mom, can I come talk to you? Just talk. Please, I told Patricia. She advised me to allow it, to say as little as possible, and to use my phone to record the conversation, which is legal in Ohio under one-party consent. I set the phone on the kitchen counter, pressed record, and covered it with a dish towel. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon in the silver Honda. Daniel looked thinner than I remembered, or perhaps I was just seeing him more accurately. Haley was dressed carefully, a soft cream sweater, her dark hair down, the whole presentation calibrated to read as non-threatening. They came in. I made no offer of coffee. We sat in the living room. I sat across from both of them. Daniel leaned forward, hands clasped, and began. The speech was long and practiced. He was sorry, genuinely, deeply sorry. He had been young and afraid and had made the worst decision of his life, and then he had been too ashamed to tell me. And the longer it went on, the more impossible it seemed to stop. He wasn't trying to excuse it. He was just trying to explain it. He knew what he'd done was wrong. He wanted to repair things between us. He didn't want to lose his mother. He was a good speaker. He had always been a good speaker. I sat very still and I listened and I tried to find one sentence in his account that diverged from the standard narrative and told me something true. I didn't find one. When he finished, Haley spoke. Her tone was collaborative, measured, the kind of voice used in mediations. Peggy, what Daniel is trying to say is that he wants to make this right outside of court. He's willing to set up a repayment plan, something formal and documented. You'd have all of that in writing. An attorney can draw it up. But once this goes to trial, the cost for everyone, financially, emotionally, publicly, is something none of us can fully predict. She tilted her head slightly. And at the end of that process, even if you win, is that really what you want people to know your family's story is? There it was. Your family's story. The threat dressed in a concerned voice. What do I want people to know? I said. About Daniel, about all of this. She made a small, encompassing gesture. It's already been stressful for people at your church, we understand. For your friends. And frankly, Peggy, for you. You deserve peace. We're offering you peace. I looked at my son. His eyes were red at the edges. He was close to crying, or performing closeness to crying, and at that moment, I genuinely didn't know which it was, and I'd accepted that I might never know. I appreciate you both coming, I said. My attorney's name is Patricia Drummond. Her office is on Broad Street. Everything goes through her. The temperature in the room changed. Daniel sat back. Something in Haley's face shifted, reorganized. Mom, Daniel said, and now there was something harder under the word. If this goes to court, it's going to come out that you've had financial struggles, that you missed payments on this house 2 years ago, that you're not, that the picture of you as just an innocent victim isn't as clean as your lawyer is presenting it. I felt it. A cold spike of fear, starting at the base of my throat. They had done research. They had prepared ammunition. The missed mortgage payments were real. I had been late twice during a period when the construction firm had delayed payroll, and I had resolved it quickly, but it existed in some record somewhere. Haley watched my face. I could see her looking for the crack. I breathed once. I think you should both leave now, I said. Peggy, I think you should leave. My voice was quiet. It didn't shake. Daniel stood up slowly. He held my eyes for a moment, and in that moment I saw something I hadn't been prepared for. Not shame, not grief, but a kind of cold calculation. Seeing what I was made of. Measuring the distance. Then he turned and walked out. Haley followed, pausing in the doorway. This is your last chance to handle this reasonably, she said. After today, things get harder. I didn't respond. I watched the door close. I stayed in the armchair for a long time after the Honda pulled away. The fear was real. I won't pretend otherwise. They had more information than I'd assumed. They were willing to use it. They were not going to simply fold. But here is what the fear did. It made the ground solid. Because I understood now, in my body and not just my mind, exactly what I was dealing with. Not a frightened boy who'd made mistakes. A man who had calculated the odds and decided, at every decision point, to deceive. Who had come to my living room today not to apologize, but to survey the field. I called Patricia that evening and played her the recording. Good, she said after a pause. He just made a threat in your home. That is now part of the record. And Peggy, the mortgage information he mentioned? It's irrelevant to the fraud claim. It's a distraction and a pressure tactic. It won't affect the case. I know, I said. Are you all right? Yes, I said, and I meant it. The civil hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday in June, 6 months after Richard Okafor's phone call. Patricia had pushed for an accelerated calendar given the documented threat, the interstate elements, and the strength of the evidentiary record. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Eleanor Voss, had agreed to hear the case without extended delay. I arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse at 8:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before the proceedings began. Barbara had driven down from Dayton the night before and was sitting beside me in the gallery, her shoulder pressed against mine, which was more comfort than I could properly articulate. Renee Morton was there too, 2 rows back, which she'd offered without being asked. Daniel and Haley arrived with their own attorney, a man named Gorski, whom Patricia had described neutrally as competent but underprepared for this specific situation. They sat at the opposite table. Daniel didn't look at me. Haley looked at me once, briefly, and then fixed her eyes forward. Patricia had structured our presentation in 3 sections. The first was the financial record. Every transfer, time-stamped, cross-referenced against the bank's records and the account activity. The account Daniel had received funds into, it turned out, had not been used for tuition payments or university fees of any kind. The money had been spent on rent, retail purchases, food, and what the bank records showed were multiple transfers to Haley's personal account over the same 5-year period. That detail, the transfers to Haley, was the one Daniel's attorney had not been ready for. Gorski had built his defense around a single, internally coherent argument: that I had known Daniel wasn't enrolled at Hargrove, that the money was an informal support arrangement between parent and adult child, and that there had been no misrepresentation because Daniel had never explicitly stated he was attending the university. I had simply assumed he was. This argument required one thing: that Daniel maintain he had never claimed to be a student. Patricia introduced the Sunday phone calls. She had, through the digital records Patricia had subpoenaed from Daniel's carrier, established a pattern of contact. She then called Carol Simmons, Trey's mother, who had driven down from Ann Arbor, as a witness. Carol testified, straightforwardly, that Daniel had maintained an active fiction about his enrollment with multiple people over multiple years, including her son, who had at various points believed Daniel was attending community college, then Hargrove, then a business certificate program, with each story adjusted as needed. He was managing several different versions, Carol said simply. Then Patricia introduced the Hargrove hoodie. It had taken some work, but she had traced the item to a university-branded merchandise website that sold clothing to the general public. The hoodie Daniel had worn in the photo he'd sent me was available for $34.99. No enrollment required. Patricia displayed the product page on the courtroom screen. I watched Gorski's composure fracture in the way that composure fractures. Not all at once, but in small, observable increments. He asked for a short recess. Judge Voss denied it. When Gorski cross-examined Carol Simmons, he tried to characterize her testimony as assumption and second-hand account. Carol, who had clearly prepared herself, answered each question with the same measured patience, adding more detail with each response rather than less, until Gorski stopped asking. Daniel was called to testify. He started well. Contained, regretful, the same performance he'd given in my living room. Constructed to read as a young man genuinely ashamed, seeking to make it right, having made poor choices but not criminal ones. He said the money had been used for living expenses, which was true. He said I had never asked directly whether he was enrolled, which was debatable. He said he had always intended to pay me back, which was the most unverifiable claim he could have made. Patricia let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Callahan, on March 14th of last year, did you telephone your mother and tell her about a business pitch competition you were preparing for at your university?" He hesitated. Yes. Were you enrolled in any university at that time? No, but were you enrolled in any university at any point during the 5 years your mother sent you monthly transfers? The pause lasted 4 seconds. I counted. No, he said. So when you discussed university coursework, professors, campus activities, and academic competitions during your regular Sunday phone calls with your mother over a period of 5 years, you were fabricating those details? Gorski objected. Judge Voss allowed the question. Daniel looked at me for the first time that morning. I looked back without expression. I was I was managing a situation that had gotten out of control, he said. It was the wrong answer, and I could see the moment he knew it. Managing a situation was not the language of a confused young man who'd panicked. It was the language of someone who had been in control of the deception all along. Haley was called next. She held herself together better than Daniel had. She was more practiced at controlled presentation. But Patricia had the transfer records. Haley's personal account had received, across the 5-year period, approximately $11,000 of the $30,000 I had sent. Patricia put each transfer on the screen, date and amount. She asked Haley to describe the source of each. Haley said Daniel had given her the money as personal gifts. Patricia said, "Gifts funded by transfers your partner received from his mother, under the fraudulent premise that he was a university student?" "I didn't know," Haley started. "Her own mother," Patricia said quietly, and placed Linda Marsh's written statement on the record. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no collapse. What happened was quieter and, I think, more final. Haley simply ran out of answers. Not all at once. She found deflections for several more questions, and Gorski objected where he could. But the record was complete, and the record said what it said, and there was no version of events that could be sustained against it. I sat at that table with my hands folded, watching my son and his girlfriend try to hold a story together that had already come apart at every seam. And I felt a grief that was clean and final, the way the last snow of winter feels. Not like loss, like the end of something that needed to end. Judge Voss issued her ruling 11 days after the hearing. I was in Patricia's office when the notification came through. A Tuesday afternoon, overcast, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as significant until it already is. Patricia read it first, then turned her laptop to face me. The judgment was complete and unqualified. Daniel Callahan was found liable for fraudulent misrepresentation and theft by deception under Ohio civil statute, and ordered to repay the full $30,000, plus court costs, plus statutory interest for the period of the fraud, bringing the total to $34,217. The court also issued a formal civil judgment that would attach to his credit record and remain enforceable for 21 years under Ohio law. Additionally, the ruling found that Haley Marsh had received funds she had reason to know were fraudulently obtained and ordered her jointly and severally liable for $11,000, the portion that had passed into her account. Detective Webb called me that evening. The Columbus PD Financial Crimes Unit had, in parallel with the civil proceedings, pursued a criminal referral. Daniel had been charged with 2 counts of theft by deception and 1 count of identity fraud under Ohio criminal statute. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 5 years, though Webb was measured about expectations. First-time offenders with cooperation rarely served maximum time, and the civil judgment would factor into sentencing negotiations. "But he will have a criminal record," Webb said. "Yes," I said, "and the civil judgment won't disappear." "No," I said, "it won't." What happened next happened in the way that significant consequences always happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of practical, ordinary ones that together constituted a life changed permanently. Daniel pleaded no contest to the theft charges and received a suspended sentence of 18 months, 3 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, and an order to comply with the civil repayment judgment. He would not go to prison. I had not wanted that, and Patricia had made clear in pre-sentencing communication that I was seeking accountability and restitution, not incarceration. But the record existed. The probation existed. The judgment existed. Gorski filed a motion to reduce the civil judgment on the grounds of Daniel's limited income. Judge Voss denied it. The the judgment stood in full. Haley's liability for her portion was handled separately. She had retained her own attorney by that point, a woman who was better prepared than Gorski, but the transfer records were incontrovertible. Haley settled her $11,000 liability and entered into a repayment schedule with Patricia's oversight. She did not contest the record. At the sentencing, Daniel addressed the court. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He said he was sorry. He said he took full responsibility. He said he understood what he had taken from his mother was not only money. I was seated 6 rows back, and I looked at him while he spoke. He was 25 years old, and he looked younger than that. And he was my son, and I loved him in the way that doesn't switch off. The way that is simply a fact of the body, like blood type. None of that changed what had happened. None of it changed what I had done and was right to do. When the judge asked if I wanted to address the court, I stood up. I had written something out and then decided not to read from it. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I said, "My son is intelligent and capable, and for 5 years he used those qualities to deceive me. I am here because I believe that allowing that to continue, quietly, inside the family, would have served neither of us. What I hope for him is that this process teaches him something about what integrity costs and what it's worth. I don't hate my son, but I will not pretend he didn't do this." The courtroom was quiet. The judge thanked me. I walked out of the Franklin County Courthouse into a June afternoon, genuinely warm, the first real summer day, the sky that particular shade of blue that makes you believe things are possible. Barbara was waiting on the steps. She didn't say anything. She just put her arm through mine and we walked to the car. The first repayment installment arrived in my bank account 3 weeks later. It was modest. The court had set a structured schedule based on Daniel's current income, but it was real. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the transfer notification on my phone and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The uncomplicated, quiet satisfaction of an account that was beginning to balance. The months that followed were not triumphant in any loud sense. My life did not transform overnight into something obviously better. What happened was quieter and more durable than that. I began to recognize gradually the weight I had been carrying. I had been sending $500 a month for 5 years while refinancing small expenses, skipping a trip to see Barbara's daughter in Portland, eating lunches at my desk instead of restaurants, making small, constant calculations that I had characterized to myself as practical, but which were, in retrospect, the calculations of a woman who had quietly rearranged her life around a fiction. The fiction was gone. The money would come back, slowly, and I could stop calculating. In September, I took the trip to Portland. Barbara's daughter, Michelle, had a 2-year-old named Lena, who I had seen exactly once in a photograph. I spent 5 days in the Pacific Northwest, eating good food, walking along the waterfront, letting Lena fall asleep in my arms in a sunny kitchen, and feeling the particular piece of time that belongs only to the present. I came back and replaced the kitchen window that had had a crack in the sill for 3 years. I bought a proper winter coat. Small things, but each one felt like evidence. At work, something shifted too. I had been performing competence for years while carrying a private distraction, the low-grade, constant hum of something unresolved. Without it, I found I had more bandwidth. I took on a new client and was offered, and accepted, a senior bookkeeper role with a 15% salary increase. My boss, Carl, told me I'd been under-promoted for years. I told him I'd been a little distracted. Renee and I began having lunch monthly, a habit that had started during the case and simply continued. The Tuesday support group became a Tuesday dinner group, informally. 4 of us meeting at a diner on the north side, talking with a frankness that surprised me with how much I valued it. I did not contact Daniel. He called once in August. A brief, stilted message saying he was doing okay, that he was working, that he didn't know what to say. I listened to it twice. I didn't call back. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew that any contact would open a door that I needed, for now, to keep closed. There was no hatred in the decision. There was also no sentimentality strong enough to override it. As for Daniel's circumstances, I learned what followed through peripheral connections. Carol Simmons, Linda Marsh, a few degrees of overlap. Daniel had moved out of the Ann Arbor apartment he'd shared with Haley. The judgment had made the shared finances untenable, and the relationship had not survived the exposure. Haley had returned to her parents' home in Michigan while completing her repayment schedule. Linda told me once that things had been very hard. I felt genuine sympathy for Linda and a neutral absence of sympathy for Haley that I did not find it necessary to examine too closely. Daniel was working at a logistics company in Columbus and making the scheduled repayment installments consistently. He was on probation, attending the required financial counseling. Whether it would become the beginning of an accountable life depended on choices I had no influence over and no longer felt responsible for. He was 25. He had time, if he chose to use it honestly. I thought about him more than I thought I would and less than I used to. Not the anxious, braced quality of the last 5 years, but something steadier and more resigned. The way you think about a storm that has already passed. One afternoon in November, I stopped on the sidewalk outside my office to button my new coat in the cold. The sky was gray, the early dark of late autumn. I stood there for a moment and just breathed the cold air, and I thought, this is what it feels like when nothing is hidden. It felt like solid ground. I drove home on the same streets I'd driven for 20 years. I made dinner. I sat at the kitchen table where the legal pad used to be, and I ate, and the refrigerator hummed, and there was no photograph on the door, and I was all right. The person who deceived you most deeply is sometimes the one you loved most completely. That is not a comfort. It is just a fact, and knowing it doesn't make it smaller. What I learned is this: trust is not the same as evidence, and love is not the same as protection. I gave Daniel both fully. What I should have given him earlier was accountability, because accountability is also a form of love, and I waited too long. If you are waiting on someone who has been lying to you, hoping that the next conversation will finally be the honest one, ask yourself what evidence you actually have. Not what you hope, what you know. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you stayed. There are more to come. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.